So question number 2 I would have for a COVID inquiry, and these are in no particular order, right? PCR tests. They were invented by a man called Mullins, right? He, interestingly enough, died in August of 2019, just a few months before COVID would hit, and just a few months before the PCR tests. His creation would be used to give you an estimate of what the tests were, the positive tests were of COVID, right? So the PCR test was used to detect the infection rates. The infection rates were used to promote the idea that these drastic measures and lockdowns, etc., needed to be implemented, right? But what's funny about the PCR test is it wasn't invented to test for COVID or coronaviruses, right? Flus. It wasn't created to test for that. It was created to enable scientists or biologists, chemists, whatever you want to call them, right? Or whoever will be using these things. It was created to enable people to amplify DNA samples. So prior to the PCR test, if you had a murder investigation and you had a tiny, tiny, tiny little fragment of blood, it might be too small to be able to extract the DNA out of it in order to be able to get the DNA evidence. But what the PCR test allowed people to do was to amplify this. So even with a tiny, tiny sample of DNA, this test would, like a magnifying glass, it would kind of zoom in and keep zooming in on that small little part, making it, for all intents and purposes, a larger part of evidence, right? So this allowed people to quicken up the process of DNA detection. It allowed people to be able to extract DNA evidence from tiny, tiny particles like blood, etc., right? So in regards to AIDS then, because Kerry Mullins was a little bit oppositional to using these things to diagnose people with AIDS, right? And what he said was that with the PCR test, if used correctly, you can find almost anything in anybody. So if you had TB, or if you had some sort of flu or some sort of virus years and years and years ago, the PCR test would be able to amplify that sample, right? And you heard the PCR test, or during the COVID, you heard the conversations of how many cycles is it running at. So what the cycles were was essentially an amplification, how many times you were amplifying the sample that you were looking at, right? And at a certain rate, a certain level of cycles, you would nearly be able to detect, as Kerry Mullins said, almost anything in anybody, right? So question number 2 for the COVID inquiry: why was this test being used? When there's blatant, when the door is open for blatant manipulation from the usage of this test. So depending on who was using it, what intents they had for using it, and what their perspective was on, or their interests in the COVID, the lockdowns, the cases, all that sort of stuff. Depending on how incentivized the person was to find a positive COVID case, using the PCR test would almost guarantee, that they would be able to make a COVID positive case out of any sample. So why were we using it?